Thank you, Kate, and I'll try to be shorter than the introduction. I took my cue from the audience rather than, oh, Jim's doing it now too, that's good. I was going to say rather than the, excuse me, move then. Address you with Jack, listen. Given the recent political events, including the Legislative Council elections, the Pembroke by-election, the opinion polls, one of the certainties of the next 4 months is, of course, that we will be hearing a lot about the joys and dangers of minority government, or as we're discussing aspects of this perhaps tonight, as power sharing. I think much of this discussion will be biased, even more of it will be misinformed. I know this from some 30 years or so of commenting on state elections and finding this to be true in every election. My part in this evening is probably to add to the confusion by setting the historical context for you and looking at it, the effect of this on Tasmania. In doing this, I want to begin by addressing something that Marion's already done in part, and that is try to distinguish power sharing from minority government, if for no other reason than to help you understand what I'm going to say about Tasmania in a few minutes. The first point that has to be made is that all democracies involve power sharing. James Madison made this point some 200 years ago when he argued that power concentrated in the hands of one man, in those days it was only men, one man or one organ of government was the very definition of tyranny. So in his view, and indeed most democratic theorists since, all democracies involve power sharing. The difficulty is, in part, that the architecture of democracy permits all sorts of designs for dealing with power sharing. The American system uses checks and balances. In the 1997 Fiji Constitution, it tried to mandate power sharing in a way which was totally destructive for that country's democratic practice. But as with any architecture, what really counts is the value of the design, or in the value of the design, is how well it works. That is, does the design suit the purpose? So what does the design of our Westminster system tell us about the value of distinguishing between power-sharing governments and minority governments in Tasmania? I think very little at one level. Certainly on first blush, it seems that there's almost no difference at all. They're both very similar, and they focus on the role of political parties as vehicles for exercising executive power. Indeed, for most people, power-sharing governments mean power-sharing executives, and not the American system of checks and balances, where the power-sharing is between organs of government so that they check and balance each other to permit scope for democratic action. So we turn to the Westminster system. And since 1688, the Glorious Revolution, the Westminster model of government has demanded that the executive be accountable to and through the Parliament. The way this is done is to require those who are commissioned as ministers of the Crown to actually sit in Parliament and to retain the confidence of Parliament in order to retain their commissions. Now here I have to explain, because it's relevant to this discussion this evening, when we talk about retaining the confidence of Parliament, we don't mean the whole Parliament, we mean a majority, which of course is why so many people talk about the need for majority government, so that the executive can control the Parliament. Now, the fact that this emerged over time meant that it was a slow evolution, if you like, in the way that the Westminster system evolved. First, there were the cliques within Parliament that joined together to guarantee their control of the King's ear, the way they gave advice to the King. But later, as the democratic urge spread, they formed political parties outside of the Parliament to win enough seats to keep their majority in the Parliament. Now, the formation of political parties, I think, is very critical to our contemporary understanding of what we mean by majority-minority government, power-sharing government in Westminster systems like Tasmania. The elites who want power need to capture the Parliament in order to exercise this power. And even more, they need to maintain that majority if they're going to hold on to their power. The however here is very important. because it raises the question of what do parties represent. Originally, of course, the expectation was that when parties were formed, they were to help organize the electorate to vote in a relatively disciplined way with people who by and large didn't read or write and needed to be able to vote for, in effect, teams. But the idea was always that the representative represented the constituency. But as parties strengthened their hold in the Parliament, it became very clear that basically MPs were delegates of their party, not representatives of their constituencies. And for about 100 years ago, it struck many political theorists that this was something wrong here. This wasn't what they thought democracy meant. And of course, one of these people was our own Andrew Inglis Clark. Andrew Inglis Clark distrusted political parties and therefore wanted an electoral system. That's to say, he wanted to change or modify the architectural design by adding a few bells and whistles. That would keep the, she's telling me it's 5 minutes, and I just have to wait there. That would keep political elites to some extent under control, or at least to make more room for diversity of representation in the Parliament. Now, some of you might wonder how it would be possible for political parties to think that by turning the people's representatives into party delegates, that they were somehow promoting democracy. Well, actually, the idea came from the reformist end of the spectrum, the socialist, democratic socialist, who argued for an electoral mandate. They wanted programmatic reform that would take place over the life of more than one parliament, and the only way they could square this idea of programmatic reform with parliamentary democracy was to take the promises they would make to the people for the program they wanted to implement. If the people endorsed it, then they would carry out their promise to the people by compelling their own members of Parliament to vote for the party's platform to keep the promise. So in effect, it was meant to be a democratic control by giving more certainty to the public than would be the case in, say, the American Congress, where the outcomes are negotiated and nobody knows when they vote precisely what's going to come out. Now I'm going to stop here with this philosophical debate before Kate gives me another message and get on to the last general point I want to make before I come to Tasmania. As I pointed out to you, the historical development of the Westminster system was all about controlling Parliament through gaining majority in order to get done what you want to get done. But the question then is, what happens when there isn't a majority? How is a Parliament supposed to be worked? How is it supposed to work then? Basically, there have been two answers to this. Canada, for example, generally prefers minority government. In Canada, when there's no majority, by and large, the governments that are formed after an election are minority governments. Many others take the other option, and that is to create a majority after the election in most countries. Federally in Australia, of course, we have the same answer, which is coalitions, but a coalition goes into the election together.